The Adamic language and the tongue of angels are the same heavenly language. This being the case, we can make the logical deduction that Adam spoke the tongue of angels. He had the gift of angeloglossy. Adam was not alone in this gift. He taught his posterity to write, at the very least, in the heavenly language. Moreover, those who called upon God were given the gift of angeloglossy as well. The Genesis account records several instances where humans speak with angels. Unfortunately, it is unclear which tongue was being used, the heavenly tongue of the angel or the earthly tongue of the human interlocutor. The Exodus account is quite different from Genesis with regard to the tongue of angels. We have documented the fact that the angel of the presence, the planet Mars, spoke the Decalogue to ancient Israel. But this is not angeloglossy per se. There is one part of the story, however, where a human does speak the tongue of angels. When Moses returned from his first encounters with Pharaoh, he was dismayed, for he had failed. Not only had Pharaoh rejected his demand to release Israel, he made the labors of Israel more onerous by denying them straw to make the bricks. Presumably, Moses spoke in Hebrew or in Egyptian with Pharaoh. The next visits would be quite different. The Lord intended to display his mighty power to Pharaoh in word and deed. When Moses returned from speaking with Pharaoh, he complained to the Lord. The Lord responded, promising that he would now deal with Pharaoh with a strong hand and that Pharaoh would let Israel go. But first, the Lord had a message for Israel. Moses delivered the message as commanded, but the children of Israel refused to listen. The Lord then commanded Moses to go unto Pharaoh. Understandably, Moses was disconcerted. He didn't understand how he could successfully convince hard-hearted Pharaoh to let Israel go when he had failed to convince his own people. What Moses did not understand and could not have known was that this time around the communication would be transmitted with great power. On the surface, the next commandments from the Lord appear no different than his previous commandments. Moses would tell Aaron the words he received from the Lord, and Aaron in turn would speak them to Pharaoh. This was the same pattern used in their previous visits to Pharaoh. Yet there is a subtle difference. The Lord will make Moses a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron will become his prophet. Biblical commentators construe this arrangement to mean that Moses will act in behalf of God with his power and authority, while Aaron will declare the word to Pharaoh. The argument continues that the primary difference would be that this time around, Moses as a god would call down the plagues from heaven. However, there is something deeper going on here. In preparation to the second confrontation with Pharaoh, the Lord explained how he wanted Moses and Aaron to interact with the king. As we noted, biblical commentators take this to mean that Moses would act with the authority of God, especially in bringing down the plagues upon the Egyptians. Aaron, as prophet, would be the mouthpiece. However, elsewhere in the Old Testament, prophets didn't need to act as gods to call down judgments from heaven. They were given full authority to do so from God in their callings as prophets. Joshua, for example, commanded the earth to stop in its rotation, making it appear that the sun stood still. He did so in his capacity as a prophet. Deborah the prophetess called upon the planets to assist her in her fight against Sisera. Elijah called down fire from heaven to consume a captain and his 50 soldiers sent by the king of Samaria. He did so twice. The Lord, in his regular dealings with his prophets, did not normally give them the status of gods to empower them to exercise miraculous godlike power. He usually directed them as to what to do, giving the prophets the power to accomplish the command at the appropriate moment. The Lord's bestowal of the status of God upon Moses in his dealings with Pharaoh was clearly outside the norm. There must be another explanation. One of the rabbinical commentaries on the scriptures, known as the Midrash HaGadol, or the Great Midrash, proposes another interpretation of the verses under consideration. Under this interpretive framework, Moses assumes the position of God, speaking in his heavenly tongue, the tongue of angels. Aaron then assumes the position of a prophet, not as the voice piece for a man, but as the spokesman for a god, which is the true vocation of a prophet. He does so using an earthly language, in this case Hebrew. Aaron must supply the interpretation, because Pharaoh would not understand Moses' speech and hear only unintelligible gibberish. Moses would receive the gift of angeloglossy, speaking the tongue of angels or the pure language of Adam and of God. Such an arrangement of linguistic and prophetic affairs follows a wider pattern of prophecy in the ancient world. Prophecy from the oracle at Delphi worked in a similar fashion. The oracle, called the Pythoness, spoke in an incomprehensible form of speech and then was interpreted by the so-called Holy Ones. This form of prophecy required two prophetic adepts, one to speak in the holy language of the gods, and another to interpret the message into the language of man. This form of prophecy should sound familiar to Latter-day Saints, where the gift of tongues required one to speak in a pure and holy language, unintelligible to man, followed by another who was given the power to interpret the communication into a human language. Within a modern Latter-day Saint context, Moses was given the gift of tongues, and Aaron was given the gift of the interpretation of tongues. Angeloglossy extended beyond the confines of ancient Israel. The ancient world at large believed that the gods and angels spoke a different language than man. How could it be otherwise, since the whole world heard the sounds coming down from the planetary angels above? The ancient world considered the practice to be the norm. One scholar pointed out that the jubilus at the end of the Alleluia in Gregorian chants is an artifact of an earlier age, where angeloglossy was considered normal. In fact, the relationship between Moses as a god speaking a divine language and Aaron as his prophetic intermediary providing an interpretation to Pharaoh represents a Hebrew version of a worldwide mythic archetype, the messenger of the gods. Messengers of the gods were gods themselves who served as intermediaries between the chief god of an archaic pantheon and mankind. In the ancient Greco-Roman world, the messenger of the gods was Hermes, or Mercury as the Romans later called him. Both Hermes and Mercury were the sons of and messengers for the king of the gods, Zeus and Jupiter respectively. The earlier Etruscan version of the messenger god was Termes. The messenger god archetype was found throughout the ancient world. The distinctive emblem of the messenger gods was the herald staff, the caduceus. Both Mercury and Hermes carried the staff, as did the Egyptian counterpart Thoth. The caduceus was normally a short staff entwined with two serpents, often surmounted by wings or crescent. Aaron was a messenger of the god Moses. Like other messengers of the gods, he carried a herald staff, a form of the caduceus. It was Aaron and his rod which called down several of the plagues upon Pharaoh according to the command of the Lord. Aaron's rod became a caduceus in a very real sense when it transformed itself into a serpent. When Pharaoh's magicians threw their rods down, which likewise became serpents, Aaron's serpent rod swallowed them up. There is a parallel to this story in Greco-Roman mythology. Gaius Hyginus relates that Mercury threw his staff at two serpents engaged in fighting, which separated the snakes. This was the origin of the caduceus. In another version of the story, the Roman poet Ovid states that the snakes entwined themselves around the rod.